let's take our seat, church. And as you take your seat, let me just kind of tell you where we are going this morning in our study of God's Word. As you know, as you're a part of Grace Bible Church, we just finished our study in the book of Job, and what a wonderful and great and encouraging book that was to us. Those who thought it was going to be a book full of depression and sadness ended up finding it to be one of the greatest gifts that God has given to us as His people in that book. And I have two more books I really have a desire to teach, books I have never taught from before, and yet they're going to have to wait for a few weeks. Because usually when I finish a series, I have things that are often on my heart, things that I think are important for us to think about, maybe be challenged about as a congregation. And this topic I'm going to talk about this morning is just one of those. I can honestly say, as I look back at my notes, I think I've never done a series on this topic. I've talked about this issue whenever I come to it in the scriptures and really speak about what it says, but really just to kind of focus our attention and our thoughts on that. I've just never done that for some reason. But I think it is a time to do it, needs to be done, and will be helpful to us in so many ways. So if you have your Bible, let's take them and turn to the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. It's right before that book that Brian read in Leviticus, what I call the speed bump of the Old Testament, right? Because when I hit that, I go, boom, boom, it just slows me down, right? Exodus is an exciting book. It's a wonderful book and a great book. And I want you to turn there. And if you want to take notes in your bulletin, I've provided you an outline to follow along so you can keep up more effectively and hopefully take some great truths home with you this day. So as you turn to Exodus chapter 16, it's really important that we understand the story, or maybe we might refer to this as the narrative. What has been happening all along in the book of Exodus to get us up to where we're going to read this morning in chapter 16. Well, you would note that the book is a book that reminds us that Israel has been in slavery to Egypt. I mean, it is a horrible slavery that no matter what they do, no matter how hard they try, they are never going to be able to rescue themselves from that slavery. So what does God do? God sends His man called Moses to go in and to lead the people out of their bondage and back to God. He is Israel's deliverer. And as you know, in chapters 5 through 12, after we learn about the slavery in Egypt in the first 4 chapters, the next section talks about how Pharaoh resisted God's plan. He was going to have nothing to do with what God was going to do with Israel by taking them away. And so you remember that in that resistance, God sent through Moses 10 plagues, of which the last plague that God sent was the death of every firstborn in Egypt who had not done something that God commanded them to do. And that is to shed the blood, to take the blood of a lamb and provide that blood over the doorposts, or the lintels, as it were, of their house. And when the death angel, when God passed through that night, if he saw the blood, you know what it says, right? I will pass over you. That's going to be your deliverance. That's going to be your escape. That blood, it's not what you've done. You can't get yourself out of this. It's been 400 years of you being in slavery. But I can do in one night what you could never do. I'm going to set you free, and I'm going to deliver you by the blood of the Lamb. And then they end up at the Red Sea, because after they go, Pharaoh still won't give up, right? You're talking about a hardhead, right? And someone who thinks he can really overtake God's plan and accomplish His will in the place of God. That's Pharaoh. So Pharaoh and all the children of Israel are at the Red Sea in chapter 13 through chapter 15. And that's where that great story unfolds, where God opens up the Red Sea, literally a sea, and dries the ground so that God's people who have been rescued might come out on the other side and begin to make a journey into what He called for them, the Promised Land. And it's in that chapter and in those sections that Pharaoh and his men pursue, and God destroys them, drowns them. And then on the other side, as they get on the other side, the children of Israel, you know what they do. They begin to sing and shout and dance and rejoice. I know some of us don't like that language, but that is what they did. Because they were so overcome by the wonder and the amazement that God had rescued them from Egypt and brought them safely through what seemed like the end of their lives with Pharaoh to a new beginning and a fresh start. So they're singing, they're dancing, the song of Miriam is being sung, and they're celebrating. And then we come to chapter 15, verse 22, and something dramatically changes. It's only been 3 days since they've sung the song of victory and triumph. And another song now takes the place of their triumphant, joyous, happy souls. Something now begins to be sung, to be said, to be the tone of their group, beginning in chapter 15, verse 22. And so that story leads us to the sin that begins to come out in the life of the children of Israel. And I want to read just for the context, beginning in verse 22 of chapter 15, if you'll follow along. And notice, I want you to notice as we read this, when you see the word then, it tells you that another circumstance happens. Something changes, and they don't like it. When it changes, this sin of theirs comes out. See if you can pick out what the sin is. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter, therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. There he made for them a statute and a regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you, which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. Chapter 16. Then they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and people shall go out and gather a portion every day, that I may test them whether or not they will walk in my instructions. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." So Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, "At evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against the Lord. And what are we that you grumble against us?" Moses said, "This will happen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and bread to the full in the morning. For the Lord hears your grumblings, which you grumble against him. And what are we? Your grumblings are not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumblings." It came about, as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "I have heard the grumblings of the sons of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God." Now, that's not hard to figure out as you read those verses what keeps coming out. What song now has replaced the song of victory and triumph? It's a song of what? Yeah, they're grumbling. Grumbling is one of those onomatopoetic type of words where it sounds like what you're doing, like grumbling. That's what they're doing. And it's interesting as you look at this word in the Bible, God has a lot to say about it, but it's interesting where he has a lot to say about it. The Old Testament term grumbling is used 21 times in the Old Testament. Of those 21 times, 13 of them are right in the section where we are reading. So it would remind us that obviously if we want to get the best text on grumbling, Understand why people grumble, what leads to that, what sets them up for that, and more importantly, what turns that around and puts the right song back in their heart. This would be the chapter and the section we would want to study. I was reading just this past week an article by Paul Tripp in his article on grumbling, a look at, quote, a little sin. He wrote, "We live with grumbling all the time. Isn't it amazing that we human beings can stand in front of a closet full of clothes and say we don't have a thing to wear? Or stand in front of a refrigerator full of food and say there's nothing to eat? We're angry at the food and go on diets because we're convinced that anything that ever tasted good is fattening. Isn't it remarkable that we have wonderful activity-filled lives full of meaning and purpose, and we grumble that we're way too busy?" Or that we can look at everything that exists and find some reason to complain. Grumbling may seem like a little sin, a little thing, but I would like to propose to you that grumbling is a pollutant in the waters of your heart. It will kill your life. Doesn't matter whether newscasters or programs capitalize on grumbling and it seems so normal and just part of what the world is like. That is one thing, as we're going to discover, should be a distinguishing mark as God's people, that we are not that kind of person. So in the Old Testament, God has a passage here for us to look at, to really dig into real deeply. And then when we come to the New Testament, we find that every time that it talks about grumbling, guess who he uses as an example to tell you how you shouldn't be and what you shouldn't do. I'll just give you two of those examples in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 10, verses 9 through 11, they're in your notes for you. It says, "We should not test the Lord." Remember, he said they were being tested in that passage. "We should not test the Lord as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come." Do you get what Paul is telling the Corinthians? Hey, listen, as God's people, one of the things you want to make sure you do not do is act like the Old Testament folks did. Grumbling. They are examples. They are warnings to you, because in their situation, God took this so serious that he sent snakes to destroy some of them. We'll find out a little later on, he did even some more severe things when people were grumbling. So the New Testament becomes an example. In the New Testament, we get example after example of our speech in such a way that it reminds us, look back at them, look at how they did, what they did, why they did it, and let them be an example and even a warning to you. One other passage I found very insightful to me was where Paul writes to the Philippians in chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. He says, "Do all things without," there's our word again, "grumbling." And then notice this, he adds another little word beside it, "or disputing." Now, what is grumbling? Grumbling is an outward discontent and a distrust. It literally is a picture here of a mob of people who are unhappy, discontent, and don't trust their leader, and they're about to overthrow them. That's the term that Paul is using here. He's saying to the church, don't you act like those who grumble and complain, maybe your translation says, and act in such a discontent and a dissatisfied way, like a mob that really is like, I've had enough of this, I'm taking over. But he adds another word. This is really interesting. And then he uses the word disputing. Do all things, whatever you're doing, without grumbling, that outward expressions of discontent and distrust, or disputing. Your translation may say the word arguing. Could be arguing. That word is an interesting word there, disputing. It comes from a Greek word, which is the word dialogamos. Dialogamos. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds like the word dialogue, doesn't it? Because that's kind of the idea from which this word dialogamos is talking about. It's talking about an inward discontent and distrust. It's having a dialogue in your mind about something you are not happy about, that you do not like, and you want it to go away. And in fact, this is exactly what's happening in the Old Testament with these people. They're not only outwardly grumbling with discontent, turning against Moses, wanting to overthrow him eventually, but they are also in their minds having this dialogue about how unhappy they are. We remember, saw in the text, we remember back in Egypt, we're thinking about it, and we're unhappy, and we're grumbling, and we are complaining. So here's the conclusion you come to. When you think about this word grumbling, both Old and New Testament, grumbling is sinfully, rebelliously complaining with your mind and your mouth. It means that what you are doing, it's a sinful grumbling, which is an expression of inward rebellious complaining, and that really is saying, God, in my mind and with my mouth, everything about me on the inside and the outside is saying, I don't like what you're doing. I'm not happy with it. And so you can understand as we go back to that passage in Philippians chapter 2 why he tells us, do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that why? You will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation among whom you appear as lights in the world. One of the things that shines so brightly in God's people in the world is when they are not like Israel was, and that is grumbling and complaining, whether inwardly or outwardly. So as we come to Exodus chapter 16, it is a rich, rich passage that is going to help us understand two things: why people grumble, and then more importantly, what you need to do to make sure you turn the grumbling off and put the gratitude back in place. And we'll learn that next week. Today, what I'd like to do is kind of set the stage for why we need to pay attention to Exodus chapter 16, why people grumble, and what you do to make sure that it gets turned around by taking us to the New Testament, and a New Testament passage that speaks so directly and so perfectly to us about the issue of our tongue and the many kind of ways we might use our tongues, whether it's grumbling, slander, gossip, lying, whatever we might do, kind of sets the stage for us by warning us about really what the tongue is capable of doing and how powerful it is. So if you'll take your Bible, let's go to the New Testament for this morning, and let's look at what James has to say to us to warn us about grumbling and the use of our tongue. Now, I want to tell you up front, James doesn't in any way talk about grumbling in the text, but grumbling is a part of the tongue. It's part of what we do with our mouths. And so these truths kind of set the stage to warn us how serious this issue of how we use our mouth is, and some serious things we need to do to make sure we're ready to listen to God's word in Exodus 16 and know why we do those things and what we need to do to make sure that we stop that and turn that around. So let's start in James chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. James says, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well." So in this passage, there are going to be 5 brief points that we're going to discover that James wants us to know and hear from God about our tongues, and they should somewhat shock us, scare us in one sense, cause us to be fearful that this little thing in our mouth could do such damage that we say, hey, take me back and let me learn from Israel as an example why I do this and what I need to do to change it. All right, you ready? So here we go. Here's my first point. Warning number 1 in James chapter 3 is the tongue is a faulty member. A faulty member. Let's look at what he says here. He says here, let not many of you become teachers. Now, why would he say that in this passage? Well, I think it's this reason. He's starting out warning teachers. Now, not everybody is a teacher, right? Not everybody in the church is going to stand up and teach. Not everybody's going to be a pastor or an elder. Not everybody's going to be a Sunday school teacher or a women's Bible leader or a men's Bible leader. Not everybody's going to do that. So he starts at the top with teachers because teachers, by definition, have to talk, right? They use their words. And he's reminding here in verse 1 that your words need to be guarded and watched. It's a warning. Notice what he says here. He says to them, let not many of you become teachers because yours is the greater judgment. In other words, it's so serious if you have this level of influence with your words as a teacher that you make sure what you say is right and how you say it is right. So he starts with them because that's where you should start, right at the top, and say to them, this is an important passage about our words, and I want you all to remember that the higher your role and responsibility in leading others, the higher your accountability is. I am confident that the day I stand before God in eternity, he is going to hold me to a level of accountability for the words I have said, not only from this pulpit, but out of this pulpit. Because he holds me to a standard and an expectation as a leader to be setting a pattern and a model for others to follow, that when he examines my words and my lips and what I say, it's not a matter of salvation, but it is a matter of whether I was pleasing him and his evaluation of my life. But he starts there with the teachers. But then he says something to everyone else, because there's not all of you going to be teachers. But he does say something to everyone else in verse 2. And if you notice here, he says, for we all stumble in many ways. Now listen very carefully. I think that the transition is real simple here. James is saying, now everybody doesn't teach. We don't have that in common. But guess what we all do have in common? We all talk. We all have a tongue. We all have a mouth. So now he turns from the teachers to everyone else here, and he says, we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, so now it's about our talk, notice what he calls him, a perfect man. Now you might read that and might not get the right idea here and think that, wow, people who always talk right are perfect. They never mess up. But the idea of the word here is that perfect here means whole or complete. It has the idea of being mature. You could read it like this, for we all stumble in many ways. Now when it comes to our speaking, here is a man who is mature. Here's an individual who is growing as he should, and is therefore, because he bridles, as it were, his tongue, he is able to control, notice what it says here, his whole body. Now you're going to be shocked at this. But what James is telling us from the very beginning is this. The first application is, pursue spiritual growth by mastering your mouth. You say, what does that mean? Well, here's what it means. That there's such an impact on the control of your tongue and your language and what you say, that it will trickle down and affect every other area in your life. Let's say I'm dealing with anger, I'm dealing with lust, I'm dealing with pride, I'm dealing with jealousy. You put anything on your list that you're trying to become more mature in and grow in. James says this, the place to start is right here, your mouth. Because if you get that one under control, it'll almost make it where those other things start falling into place. Now that's usually not where we start. We start with, I need to get my anger under control. I need to get this, and we do. All those sins need to be under control, and we need to deal with those. I get that. But what we overlook here is that a key to the rest of our whole body and our whole life is learning to start with your mouth. So the first thing here that James wants us to know and warns us about is you have this member in you called your tongue, and there's a lot of fault in it, a lot of problems. If you and I want to reach tongue perfection, we could say, in this life, we won't ultimately do it. But if we want to reach some of perfection in our life, then make it your aim to start with that area of your life. Now, most people probably don't think of that, but that's where James starts. So the first thing he warns us about is how faulty the tongue is. The second thing is found in verses 3 and 4. Notice what he says. Now, if we put the bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder, whatever the inclination of the pilot desires. Verse 5, so also the tongue is a small part of the body. Now stop right there. I think the second thing James wants us to know is that your tongue has incredible force and power. It's not something that is very faulty, and you need to control it because it affects everything else in your life, but it's also very, very powerful. So what does he do? He gives us this illustration about the tongue, and he says that what we do is we put the bits into the horse's mouth. And then in verse 4, he talks about a ship. And he says we also have this thing called a rudder. Notice something about these two things. Bits and rudders are small compared to everything else, right? Kent Hughes says that a horse is a half a ton of raw power. And yet that bridle, that bit, has the ability to control him. And notice what it says here, so that they will obey us. How does a 150, 250-pound individual control a half a ton of raw power? He controls him by something very small. You see, the force that that horse has is under the control of something much smaller. Your tongue has a very powerful force to it. He says, look at the ships. They are directed, as it were, by the governor of the ship. And how does he steer that massive ship? He does it with a small rudder. And the point is very simply this, in the implications. Our tongues, though small, have the force and the power to determine and direct our lives and the lives of others. That's what he's reminding us of. You notice James is getting a little more serious each time. He said, hey, just recognize you got this thing in your mouth called your tongue, and there's some faulty problems with that. And then he moves on and he says, I want you to know this, that tongue of yours has some incredible force and power that it can do things with. And the implication is simply this here. Don't minimize the power of your mouth. Don't minimize the power of your mouth. Oh, that's right, James. If we want to absolutely grow, we need to start with our mouth, mastering it. And the reason you need to master it is because it has such power to direct and govern all kinds of things around you in people's lives. You know this, right? Think about relationships that have been destroyed or healed because of the words that have been said. Think about a person who has turned away from Christ because of the power of the words that have been said, or they've turned to Christ because of the right words that have been said. I'm not in any way negating the sovereignty of God, the election of God, any of those things. I'm just telling you that on the human side, we need to grasp that this tongue, though small, like a rudder and like a horse's bit, it is powerful enough to steer and turn and direct a lot of things. The words maybe that you find out that someone has been talking about you or saying about you has the incredible power to impact your life, for good or for bad. What would happen in our marriages if the power of our tongues were harnessed, as it were, by love? What would happen in our parenting if the great boast of our tongues were honed in and they started coming across with a gentle but firm and corrective and wise voice? What would happen on your job if the power of your tongue was directed towards building up those that you worked around rather than tearing them down? What would happen if on online social media, you started letting that become a platform where your words were more helpful than harmful, more encouraging than discouraging? You see, what James is saying, you don't realize what your words, which are in your mouth, that obviously come out in your fingers on social media, are really doing sometimes. Well, let's drive it home here. What would happen in our church if the power of our tongue was unleashed to minister to one another, to love, to serve, to sacrifice, to think well, to talk well of others around us? What would happen? What would happen if our tongue was unleashed and the rudder of our tongue was driven to pray and ask God to do the exceeding abundant above all that we could ask or think in our church and in our lives? What do you think that would do? Surely something more powerful than the destruction that the tongue can do. So the tongue is a faulty tongue. The tongue is a forceful tongue. Let's go to the third section of these verses and notice what James says in verses 5 and 6. He goes on to say, so also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire? And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell. Now listen, brothers and sisters. I told you each point James gets a little stronger. He starts out telling us you've got some fault in you and it's in your mouth. And you not only need to know you got a fault, it's a forceful, powerful thing that can do a lot to heal or destroy. And now you need to know, James says, this third warning is your tongue is fiery. It's like fire. It's like fire. Notice what he says in the passage here. He tells us about the devastation of the tongue in verse 5. He says, see also the tongue is a small part of the body. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. You get the picture here. It only, the good way of saying this, it only takes a spark to get a fire going, right? But in reality, in life, that small spark used in a wrong way can do devastations to people. He says here that this devastation is like a fire that is just spreading through a forest. You ask those people in California who are now experiencing those wildfires. Talk to them about how scary and devastating it is and how fast-moving and uncontrollable and destroying everything in its path a wildfire is. They know the devastation of fire. And James is capitalizing on this, and James is saying, I want you to see not only has your tongue got a fault in it, I want you to see how forceful and powerful it is, but I want you to see it has the fire to destroy. That's what it will do. Now, he tells us not only something about how devastating it is, but how devilish it is. Did you notice in verse 6 these words, these strong and somewhat frightful and scary words that James used? And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among the members, and that which defies the entire body, and is set on the fire of a course of life, and is set on fire from hell. So if tongue is like a fire, what's fueling that fire? Well, notice James says it's hell. It is hell. What he is reminding us here is that our words open the doorway to hell itself. Our words can display hell, smell like hell, and bring the devastation of hell. That's what he's saying. You think James is exaggerating? You think maybe James might have just had a bad day and he thought, I'm going to really get those people today that are really irritating me, and I'm going to put that verse right in there for them to let them know they better shut up. You think he's had a bad day? He's somewhat upset with people? I don't think so. I think James knows the seriousness of the power of our tongue. In fact, when we come back to Exodus next week, you're going to discover God's attitude and God's response to the grumbling. In fact, in that passage, in that section, I should say, he is going to burn up a whole group of people with fire because of their grumbling. And then one day, because of the grumbling and complaining, he's going to turn and open up the ground and swallow a whole group of people. He said, that's really serious. That's right, because our tongue is like the fire set on fire by hell. If anything, what that should remind you of is that God doesn't take grumbling as a light thing. In fact, it's kind of a contrast, or a parallel, I should say, to what God did with Ananias and Sapphira, right? When Ananias and Sapphira lied, God struck them both dead. And when you look at those texts, you often wonder, does that mean when I tell a lie, God's going to strike me dead? And if he didn't strike me dead, I must not be lying? The point of the text is to show you what God thinks about lying. Not that everybody dies when they lie. There wouldn't be a person in the room today, myself included. And when God opens up the ground and swallows a whole tribe of people, and God descends fire from heaven above and just burns a group of people up, it's not because that God is going to do that every time someone grumbles, and therefore if he doesn't do that or do something devastating in your life, you must not be grumbling. No, it's just telling you how he thinks and responds. It's a serious matter to him. And James is telling us here in this passage, your tongue is like a fire that is set on fire by hell itself. So the application is pretty obvious. Consider the effect of your destructive wildfire words. Just consider that. Just stop and think about how destructive your words have been. Now, James doesn't give us a list in the passage. His goal isn't to give us a list of words and the way our tongues might be set on fire by hell. He's warning here. He's challenging them. He's not giving them applications at this point. We'll come to those later. We'll talk about them. But here's an obvious list of destructive wildfire kind of language that spreads and destroys and devastates others. We could put on that list words like gossip. Gossip is when you talk to others, but you won't talk to the person. That's gossip. We could put criticism on the list. Criticism of your spouse to others, your boss or your employees. Just criticizing, not liking that inward unhappiness and disappointment and that inward rebellion. I don't like this and I'm going to make sure it goes the way I want it to. You could put sarcasm, snide jokes, statements about others. Flattery is even a form in the scriptures of the tongue being set on fire from hell. Because flattery is simply buttering up someone because of your greedy purpose to get what you want. Lying is another fire spreader for sure. Complaining and grumbling, which we're going to work at and look at more in detail. Those are just a list of things over the next few weeks we're going to look at. Why do we fall into that? I don't want to fall into that because this is a serious matter that James is reminding me that my tongue is like fire. Fire that's been set by hell. So God, help me. Help me figure out how to stop my mind and my mouth. And what is it that will do that? What will change that in my life? Because the tongue, James says, is a very fiery thing in your mouth. Let's go to the next one. We have just two more and we're done. The next warning is found in verses 7 and 8. For every species of beast and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poisons. So the first thing he tells us here now is that he wants us to see the tongue as something that is very feisty, right? That's you know they're all going to be with F's today, so that's the word I think best fits the text here. Notice what he says here. As he talks about the taming of beasts, he says every species of beast is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. I mean, you've all seen that, right? If you ever go to Disney, you go to any theme park, you've been splashed by the water of a dolphin, right? They've tamed that thing. Or a whale. Or a lion. And what James is saying, every species of beast has been tamed by the human race. But notice what he says in verse 8. The tongue is untamable in verse 8. But no one can tame the tongue. Now let me just tell you again, James is not telling us that it cannot be controlled and it cannot be changed. What he means is in our own ability, no human can do that. Humans might tame animals, but they can't tame this thing in their mouth. And so what James is doing here is reminding us here to think of this fourth application, that we need to admit our inability to change our tongue on our own. If you're going to change, it won't be because you buckled down and said, okay, I'll do better. It'll be something else that will have to happen. And that leads us to the last and the final warning that James gives us. It's in verses 9 and 10. With it we bless, that is with our tongue, our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. Here's the last thing that I think James wants us to be aware of, and that is how forked our tongues are. They go in two directions, as it were. On the one hand, James says that we bless our Lord and our Father. And we're saying, God, you're so great, you're so awesome. We're speaking rightly as we speak to him. But then we turn around to others and we curse them. And I don't mean like four-letter words. We speak things that are destructive and destroying to them, that are not the way God thinks of them and relates to them. We curse them. And notice what James is saying. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. What's James doing? He is saying, change has to take place. You can't change your tongue yourself. No human can do that. But we've got to change. This can't keep going on, he said. This ought not to be. Well, though James, listen carefully, does not give us how to change here, he does give us a hint, and it's going to set us up for next week. Notice what he says again in verses 11 and 12. He talks about these fountains. He says, does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? And that's just a question that you know the answer is obviously no to. Can a fig tree, he says, produce olives? Or a vine produce figs, nor can salt water produce fresh water. Now here's the point. You should note the words that are circled there. He's talking now about the very source of the problem. The reason that a fountain doesn't send fresh and bitter water is because their sources are different. The reason that a fig tree doesn't produce olives is because their source is different. And the reason a vine doesn't produce figs is because their source is different. What he is reminding us here is what Jesus said in Luke 6, verses 43 to 45. It is out of the heart that the what? Mouth speaks. You see, the real problem is a heart problem. The real problem is what's going on inside of us, in our minds, coming out of our mouths. Or if not even coming out of our mouths, it's still going on in our minds. And the question is, what is going on there? Well, God gave us Exodus 16 in that section and the children of Israel as an example to show us what's going on in there and what's coming out and how you turn around what's going on inside of you and what comes out of you. So that when you read James, you'll be warned and you'll be aware of really the power and the effect and all the tongue is and what it can do. But now I'm really going to get to the source of the issue, my heart. The very thing on the inside of me. So James warns us in such a way that he reminds us we've got to grapple with this. We've got to get our hands on this. Whether it seems big in your life or small, there's no such thing as a little grumbling. It's always, in God's eyes, a big thing. So how do you go from here? What would I encourage you to do as our team is going to come now and we're going to sing and we're going to close in this song this morning? What would I encourage you to do this week to get ready to see in Exodus 16, what is it that you need to change on the inside so that outward things look different and sound different from you? Well, as the music team comes, let me just give you 3 things I would ask you to do. Number 1, today you probably should start agreeing with him about your sin. There is going to be no help from God. There is going to be no grace. He resists proud people. He gives grace to what? Humble people. So God, I'm telling you, I struggle with this. I'm grappling with this. I want my tongue to be like you want it to be. You know, as Wesley's hymn said, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise." How about just one of them? Forget whether you get 1,000. He's just saying, if I had that many, they'd all be praising you. But just your tongue, one tongue. Agree with him. You need to change. Number 2, I would encourage you this week to pray and ask him to change you. That's what prayer is. Prayer is your cry out to him. I agree with you. I can't do this on my own. I'm asking you. I'm praying that you will change me. Here's the 3rd thing I'd ask you to do. Trust him to change you. Because a lot of people pray about a lot of things but never really believe he's going to do it, right? They pray and they ask God, I need this. I want you to meet me here. Change this in my life. But they walk away not really saying, and he's going to do that. So you need to agree with him, pray to him, and trust him. Trust him that he's going to bring from your saltwater mouth, as James calls it, some sweet water. A sweet water. When that happens, we'll live in a crooked and a perverse world that they'll ask you, why are you so different? Why is the light of your life shining like that? In such a way that the light of your delight and joy and happiness and satisfaction rather than grumbling is in your life. That's part of what it means to shine in this world. Let's pray together.